Good morning. Thank you all so much for being here. It's about 11:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the Flash Fiction panel. The way that this is going to roll, come on in, have a seat, stand, do whatever you want to be comfortable. I'm going to give a brief, if there's an open seat next to you, raise your hand. All right, find a spot. So I'm going to give a brief overview of kind of the background of each of the panelists that are up here. Unfortunately, Meg was unable to join us today, so it's just the three of us, but don't worry, we've got you covered. We have a couple of questions to kind of get you started in understanding what the form is, and then from there, there's a couple of things that we're going to talk about that we kind of specialize in, each of us, and then we're going to open the floor to questions so that you guys can open your own questions about Flash fiction or anything that is similar to that form. Sound good? Awesome. Okay, so my name is Lesle Salas. To my left is Jay Bradley, and to my right is Nicole Oquendo. I'll start with Nicole. She's a writer, educator, and editor interested in multimodal compositions and translations of nonfiction and poetry, but she also does write flash fiction. She's a member of the Sundress Publications Board of Directors, as well as an assistant editor for Flaming Giblet Press, the managing editor and nonfiction editor of the Florida Review, and the nonfiction editor for the annual Best of the Net anthology. Her essays and poetry can be found in Cutback, Diagram, Filling Station, Gulfstream, and the Southeast Review, among others. She is the author of the chapbooks Some Prophets and She is Wolf, and the hybrid memoir Telomeres, and the visual poetry collection We Animals. And there's one more coming out. Which one is missing?
Ringing Gendered We.
What?
Ringing Gendered We.
Yeah, that's the last one. It's not out yet. So definitely, yeah. I always forget the title of the last one. So definitely check those out. Jay Bradley is the author of the forthcoming story collection, The Adventures of Jesus Christ, Boy Detective. His flash fiction chapbook, Neil, won 5 Quarterly's 2015 e-chapbook contest. He runs the Central Florida-based reading series, There Will Be Words. You should definitely check it out. It's a lot of fun. And he lives at iHeartFailure.net. And again, I'm Lesle Salas. I hold an MFA in creative writing from UCF, and I'm a graduate of the University of Denver Publishing Institute. By day, I help students in higher education at Full Sail University master the art of effective communication and storytelling. And on nights and weekends, I write in all genres, including poetry, prose, screenwriting, and comics. I lost my place in my own bio. Okay. My work has appeared in the Southeast Review, Smoke Lawn Quarterly, Borough Press's 15 Views Volume 2, and more. I serve as the graphic nonfiction editor for Sweet A Literary Confection, and I frequently contribute to the Gloria Sirens online. So, now that you know who we are, and so many smiling faces, thank you all for being here. Let's start off with a definition of flash fiction. So either Jay or Nicole, whoever wants to start, how would you define flash fiction, or what would you consider to be flash or not flash?
Nicole, would you like to start?
1,000 words or less. That was brief.
That's actually very ironic. I would add a little bit more to that, though. Yeah. Flash fiction is typically 1,000 words or less. I would also add that the best flash also straddles the line between fiction and poetry. Or in this case, there's also flash nonfiction and poetry, where you have the tightness and lyricality of poetry, but also there's some sort of narrative arc that's contained within this brief space within flash. So for me, that adding to that definition, not just 1,000 words, but also the best flash is basically you're being dropped in the middle. You have in the middle of the action, and you only have this much to really get into the story and get out.
Yeah, one of the things that I find really interesting, especially in terms of flash nonfiction, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, because if it wasn't you, I was going to go rogue and talk about it, so I'm glad that we got it out of the way really early, is that the white space in the piece is just as important as the actual prose that's going on in the piece. So actually utilizing that white space, especially in different types of nonfiction, like lyric essay, which we can talk about a little bit more if you guys want to do that too, to signify different transitions and allow the reader to sort of immerse themselves inside the broader story that's happening inside the narrative arc, I think is really important too.
And that goes back to the whole connection of poetry in flash fiction, is that use of white space. In poetry, you have stanzas, and you have the white space between stanzas. And with flash fiction and flash nonfiction, that same white space can act as that breath or that pause that you need to really get take in what you're experiencing.
I would absolutely agree with what both of you said, and I would add that when you're looking at Flash, I've seen Flash anywhere from like 500 to 750 words up to, I would say, pushing the upper limit is 100, or it's 1,500. But in that space, you're juggling the white space, but it can help really to think of it as vignettes, or one or maybe even multiple short enclosed scenes. So you're looking at something in a very, very small segment. You're basically getting in and getting out, getting in as late as possible and getting out as early as possible, with the objective of just giving your reader just enough information to make them wonder. And it's up to them to do what's called, in comics, it's called closure, where you have to fill in the gap between panels. You're going to do the same thing in flash fiction. You're making your reader figure out what happened before this, what happened after, and maybe what's missing in the middle.
And where it gets really interesting too is there's actually subgenres within Flash. So you have microfiction, which is typically fiction under 250 to 300 words.
Yeah, it's very small.
Tweet fiction, or twitfic, where it's a story told in 140 characters or less. There's at least 2 online mags that specialize in twitfic. Nanoism and 7x20. Yep. Those both specialize in those tweet-long fictions.
Yeah, an example of that, I don't know if you guys have heard this going around, but what is it? For sale, baby shoes never worn?
Yeah,
Is that
Hemingway.
it? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's a 6-word story. So there's some places that specialize in your 6-word stories or your 100-word stories. So this is something that's become very prolific. And I think that kind of brings us into the next kind of question is, why is this so popular? We have, like, Twitter is huge, Facebook updates are big, but they can be long, but a lot of people, like, we have shorter attention spans as writers and as readers, and this Flash format really appeals to what your readers want as well as maybe what you're capable of in your very busy life. You know, it may be easier to sit down and focus on this tiny little snippet of something and just write a whole bunch of them and string them together, as opposed to, like, slogging through thousands of words to write a 6,000 word novel that makes you just want to, like, rip your face off. So there's a couple of reasons why you might choose to write or publish in this genre.
So for me, Flash, for me, was kind of a transition from. So for a long time, I was a slam poet. For, I would say, about 10 years. I competed at 5 national poetry slams. And when you've listened to a lot of slam poems, there's a certain narrative arc to slam poems, where they basically are telling a story. There's less poetry in it, and really it's just more exposition and narrative. And what I have found is that by transitioning to Flash, is that a lot of the lessons I've learned in slam has helped me transition into Flash. And I think that the reason why it's becoming so interesting and popular is because people are they're taking risks with the genre. So there's a whole anthology of science fiction Flash called Gigantic Worlds, where it's nothing but sci-fi Flash, which is really interesting. That you're starting to see that there's also bizarro Flash fiction, which is bizarro is a genre where you take something really outrageous and it takes it really seriously. Using the Flash as a skin, and using the craziness of that genre to tell that particular story. I think it goes back to what Leslie said about the short attention spans. Our attention spans are getting shorter. We're saturated in social media and technology, so our attention spans are maybe eroded a little bit, or maybe we've become selective because there's so much amazing content out there that. Whereas like a 50,000 word novel, that takes a lot of time and attention to you to focus on. With a Flash story, I think a great definition of Flash comes from I think it was the Field Guide to Flash Fiction. In part, there's a whole essay that talks about the history of Flash, and one of the things they point out in the Chinese call it smoke long, where it's fiction that takes for you to read as long as smoking a cigarette. So that's where I find it really interesting why Flash is becoming such an emerging way of writing, is because I think maybe it's because the content, we have so much content out there, and Flash allows people to really, get in and get out as fast as they can. So they're able to read, and they're also able to do other stuff in their day.
See, it's really interesting that you talk about it being so brief because for me, I actually approach it probably exactly the opposite of how you approach it. I like, especially as both an editor and a writer, I like to approach I like stories that reveal themselves to me over time, over multiple reads. So what I appreciate the most about Flash is that really, really good Flash is that so much care is placed in the spacing of every single word. Every word that you choose is so important. Every sentence is so important that these stories reveal themselves over time, over multiple reads, more and more stuff that you don't catch on a first read. Every single thing is just, it has so much weight. And so I find myself reading a piece of Flash 6, 7 times, 8 times, over and over again. So I'm spending as much time with a, really tiny Flash piece as I would with a really, really long story, except, it's just multiple reads of the same piece. But the more I dig in, the more new stuff I find, and I just get so excited about that stuff. I don't know, I'm geeking out right now real hard, so don't mind me. But, I mean, that's just personal preference, but oh man, especially with the stuff that plays with the white space that gives you those moments to pause and really think about, what did this author intend by using, the word waddle instead of limp, or what did this author intend in terms of the pacing when the sentences are really short and really quick. How does that affect my read, the speed at which I read? It's all just crazy word science. I don't know, makes me excited.
Yeah, that's really good because speaking about the density of what happens in Flash anything, it's often likened to prose poetry, and a lot of scholars would argue they're exactly the same thing, except maybe written from different perspective, where a prose poet might be thinking, language first in poetry, and a Flash fiction writer or Flash nonfiction writer might be thinking more structure and story, but at the end, you still get the same result. You get this short, tiny snippet of something that's really dense, it's really, really, really detailed, and it leaves this audience with an impression of, okay, they can read it and be done on a really shallow read, or they can spend a lot of time with it, and they can pull something from it every single time. So that's a really awesome and kind of flexible thing that a lot of readers and writers can get from the genre, which is neat. So with that being said, let's move into just a couple of craft considerations. We've already started talking about them, but I want to start talking about a little bit about using sensory imagery to scene build while also doing characterization. One of the things that happens in Flash is you have a very limited amount of space to work your magic. And if you're a very verbose writer, or if you just you just write and you just write and you write, you're going to have to find that you're going to have to cut a lot, and you're going to have to do a lot with your words that kind of do double duty. So how can you show and tell and do like 50 trillion other things all at once in the smallest amount of space as possible? And one of the things that I've found is really super paying attention to sensory imagery, to your setting, and using that to characterize the people that are being featured, or the characters that are being featured in your Flash. So, you have your visually descriptive language, which normally talks about, in imagery, you have your 5 basic senses, which you've got, sight, taste, smell, touch, and hearing. But there are actually like 22 or 23 senses that you have. It's not just the 5. So you might want to appeal to a sense of time, a sense of tension or balance, like tension or stretching. That's a sense. Pressure, that's something that you can feel. It's a bit more specific for touch. The same as the senses of thirst and hunger, of pain, of being itchy. There's thermoception, which is your ability to feel hot or cold, or proprioception, which is the really cool thing of like you can close your eyes and you can still touch your nose because you know where your body's at. Magnetoception, some people are really good at this, some people are not. Some people always know which way is north, or they can tell where the ocean is, and other people are really bad at identifying magnetic fields. And then there's the cool thing that you can play with, which is synesthesia, which is when your senses get mixed up. And that's where you can kind of jump into more figurative language, and you can start using metaphors and similes to describe things in a way you might not know. So like if you're describing a drink, you might say, instead of saying it was an apple drink, you might say it tasted green. And then you start going to really cool places, and then you start going to the really dense language, like Nicole was kind of explaining. Do either of you? I know it's a lot. I just gave you a bunch of stuff.
I'm processing.
So if you guys want to find me later and be like, I need that list again.
That list was very yellow.
It was very yellow. But that's kind of...
Sorry.
That's an anesthesia joke.
Yeah, so basically what I found the key is use fresh language. Describe things that are familiar in ways that maybe you wouldn't have originally thought to explain them, but when your reader reads it, it just clicks and they're like, oh, that's perfect. Like, I know exactly what they're talking about. Like, a friend of mine described like the little point, like girls who've stared at the back of boys' necks, you know what I'm talking about. This little comma of hair that hangs out in the middle of a boy's neck when his hair's grown out too much, he hasn't gotten a haircut. Like, describing it as a comma. Like, in my head I went, that's perfect. But then, like, a bunch of boys are like, I don't know what you're talking about. So it's up to you. It depends on what you want. It's the first example that came to mind. I'm sure I'll come up with a better one later. But
in terms of what Leslie was just mentioning, I was thinking while you were talking about how I actually started writing Flash. It was an accident because I am a really, I mean, I'm sure you guys are the same way, but when you're a really harsh critic of your own writing. And so I started writing Flash by accident because I would just cut and cut and cut and cut so much of what was actually on the page until I was left with less than 1,000 words when I started with a story that was, gigantor long. So what ends up happening over time is you use, or at least for me, what I ended up doing was using one word instead of 7 words to describe something, and just things started getting more and more and more and more compact. And I think that with revision, because it's extremely, extremely important, especially with the case of flash fiction, to talk about revision, these things, even if you end up with something that's maybe a little bit long, it'll get shorter and shorter and shorter as you go through and really start picking out, okay, what one word can I use to condense down this sentence? How can I do that? And it's a really tough exercise, but it's extremely rewarding because you're left with something that's really rhythmically dense. It sounds nice to listen to when people read it out loud. And I think that's another way that we blend that sort of hybrid prose poetry situation together and end up with something really magical when we're dealing with Flash.
Yeah, absolutely.
awesome. So with that being said, Nicole, can you kind of talk about how writers can focus on narrative structure? You said like using Freytag's pyramid and tone and mood elements to build on character psychology.
So for me, my big thing, and I have some students that are visiting the conference today, which is really exciting. So you guys have heard me talk about this more times than I can count, so I apologize in advance. Everybody else, this is really new and exciting. So narrative structure for me is the most important thing. Narrative structure and language together are really important, but in terms of, especially if you're just starting to write Flash and you kind of don't know where to start, I think that narrative structure is really important. Now, following that structure, utilizing character psychology elements to sort of push the narrative forward rather than relying on exposition, incredibly important when you only have 1,000 words to tell your story, right? Even Freytag's pyramid, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a second because some people look kind of confused and I don't want confusion. I think that even Freytag's pyramid actually starts with exposition. It's the very first thing in the pyramid. And I say, no, Gustav Freytag, that's a horrible thing to start with. Never start with exposition. Always, always, always start flash fiction with some sort of inciting moment, some sort of inciting incident that draws your reader in. Something actually has to happen. One of the things that I find a lot, because just working as an editor and also a professor of creative writing, I read so much just raw, unpublished, just new, fresh writing. And one of the things that I see over and over and over again is this long, drawn-out exposition that starts the story. And so even with Flash, I catch people all the time, the story doesn't start until, page 2 or page 3, so we have 1 page of actual story. And all of the rest of that stuff doesn't need to be there at all. It makes me so sad when that happens. So, and I always try to catch myself when I'm doing it too. So one of the things that I was talking about, because I said a whole bunch of stuff really fast, so let me try to parse that out. When I talk about character psychology elements, I don't mean, because some of you guys have probably done exercises before where you've written out a character sheet, like my character's favorite food is macaroni and cheese, and all of that kind of silly stuff that has nothing to do with the story, right? So character psychology is not my character's favorite food is pizza. Character psychology is things like, my protagonist really hates their father, right? And so why would you want to know that? Well, if your story is taking place on or around Father's Day, for example, that tension is going to build up and lead to something that actually propels the narrative forward, we hope. Knowing that bit of information is really key. One of the examples I use when I'm teaching all the time, I had a student that she wrote this story and the protagonist was afraid of dogs, and we never understood why at all. It was not a thing that that happened in the story. And so afterwards I was talking to her about it, and I'm like, hey, student, why is this protagonist afraid of dogs? I'm really curious. And she told me that her protagonist is afraid of dogs because her sister was chased off a cliff by wild dogs. And it's okay to laugh. It's okay. So, I was really astounded, and I paused and I took a second to take that information in. And my bit of advice in that moment was to, probably tell the reader that happened in some way, shape, or form, because that's really important information that is going to propel the narrative forward in some way. So yeah, if your protagonist's sister was chased off a cliff by wild dogs, tell your audience in a sentence or two. You don't have to do, a really long info dump, and especially in Flash, because we don't have time. But sometimes we want to tell these things to our audience. So in terms of story structure, there are things like the hero's journey, which is 12 steps long, and it takes a lot of time, and if you guys want to talk about Hero's Journey later, we totally can. But I prefer, when working with Flash, to utilize Gustav Freytag's pyramid. Freytag's pyramid is brief, and it's brief enough for me to talk about in a minute, so I will share that with you. It's from Technique des Dramas, and I totally butchered that German, but just bear with me. So this is really old. It's from 1863. He starts with exposition in the pyramid. So imagine a pyramid. If you have synesthesia, imagine a yellow pyramid. So again, I skip the exposition part because I think that modern readers are a little bit different than the readers that Gustav Freytag was trying to appeal to. Start with the inciting incident, and then you have your more generic stuff that you guys all know about. If you're here, you've written fiction before, at least I think so. So you know about rising action, you know about climax, and you know about falling action. So this is all stuff that happens in the pyramid. But one of the things that happens in the pyramid that I think is the most important thing, and this is an element from ancient Greek, so I want to make sure that I tell you guys about it because it is cool. If you guys like ancient Greek, I don't know, talk to me after. So anagnoresis. This is a really fun vocabulary word that we're all going to sound really smart when we're drinking wine later and talking about anagnoresis. This has worked for thousands and thousands of years, all right? So just trust me when I tell you that this is a really important moment in storytelling. Anagnoresis is the moment of realization where the protagonist makes a critical discovery of some sort. So if you build anagnoresis into your story, especially if you find a way to build it into your Flash, you've got a moment where something's automatically at stake, so we're not making one of the huge mistakes that writers make where we write stories that are accidentally situations that are about nothing because they have no weight. I do it all the time by accident. I think I have a really good idea, and then I realize that it was just a bunch of dudes like sitting around a table drinking coffee and nothing happened. So let's not write stories like that, right? So the anagnoresis is a moment where you have a built-in change for the protagonist. So, and again, this is something that we've been doing for thousands of years, and it works. So anagnoresis, we are all much smarter now that we know this word. So know what kind of story that you're trying to write in terms of narrative structure, and you can actually emulate, things like Freytag's Pyramid, things like Hero's Journey, in a really small amount of space. I don't know about you guys, but for me, when I sit down to write, I need some sort of plan, because if I don't have one, my story sort of spins out of control, and then it turns into a moment where I'm writing about nothing. It's a series of situations rather than a story, and those things are very, very different. So one of my suggestions is, know what kind of story you're trying to write and know what kind of stories those sound like. So if you're following a comedic narrative structure, for example, read other comedies. Not hard to do. If your story is really sad or tragic, read other tragic things, sort of get a feel for what those stories are structured like so you can do it better. Not to sound arrogant, but
That's what we want.
That's what we want. We want to read things and do better. At least I do. And in terms of that, I think that in terms of suggestions for Flash, I really like the literary journal Brevity. It's a Flash nonfiction journal, but we can learn from that. It's just like fiction, except that it really happened. There's no difference, in my opinion, between really well-written fiction and really well-written nonfiction. So you can definitely find that. I talked about that a lot just now.
Do you have anything you'd like to add?
So I'm the opposite of Nicole. I don't like having a plan. Planning is bad because when you start planning out things, then I feel like for me as a writer, personally, there's a certain magic that you lose of stumbling onto the idea and discovering the idea through the process. So all of my stuff always starts with a singular core idea, and I just let that unfurl. So for one example, I wrote a flash fiction piece about a kid who watched RoboCop and decided that he wanted to practice doing cocaine. And so basically asking the question, what would that be like? How would I practice doing cocaine? And it's a whole story about him working his way up, practicing doing cocaine off the blade of a knife. Never actually does the cocaine. That never happens, but there's a bunch of other stuff that happens. The Jesus Christ Boy Detective series that I created, that was the idea kind of came to me from the back of my mom's car while going to go see the Muppets 5 years ago. And so all of a sudden I go, what would it be like if Jesus Christ was trapped in the body of a boy detective and forced to solve mysteries? And that's how that idea, that core idea kind of unfurls itself. So I'm not personally, and all of you have either figured out what your process is or you're still on that journey of what your writing process is. I'm not a planner at all. I don't like to plan. I like finding a core idea and letting the core idea unfurl itself by writing it out and figuring it out as I go along.
I think a really key concept that both of you have talked about, we have a pantser who writes by the seat of his pants, and we have a planner who writes with a plan. Either is fine. It's dependent on you. But there's a clear conflict that they seem to start with. You have to have, in order for the story to be about something, what is the conflict? What is at stake? Who wants what? What are they willing to do to get it? You need to be able to answer those questions in order to move forward with some sort of story, to be able to tell something. And what your character notices is just as important as what they don't notice. So what you do write about in a flash fiction can be as important as you don't write about. Because if it's Father's Day and somebody's got daddy issues and dad never shows up in your piece of flash, what does that say? How does that impact the story? So you want to make those sort of choices, those really specific, deliberate choices when doing your flash about what to include, but also what to omit. Now, with that being said, and you mentioned the Jesus Christ Boy Detective stories, Jay, can you talk a little bit about how to build a larger narrative using interconnected flash pieces?
So I started an MFA program last year, and I had no idea what I was going to create for the thesis at all. And in my first class, which was a flash fiction workshop because I wanted to get my feet wet, was my first time in an MFA, also no residency, which means it was all online, figuring out what it was that I wanted to do, and I started writing these flash pieces about a boy named Neil and his father. And I didn't exactly have a core, so this was the first thing I ever worked on where I didn't have a core idea. But I started exploring what is this like with this one particular person raising this boy by himself, and writing after 3 or 4 of them, figuring out, okay, here's the core idea. This is a story about a father who's kidnapped his son from the mother of his child because he was kidnapped as a child by his father from his mother. So that kind of starting to build the question of what is it like for someone who is kidnapped, who knows he was kidnapped, who figures out he was kidnapped and never reunites with his mom, figuring out what is life like him being a father, and also making the same decisions that his father made, but also not making the same decisions his father's made. So figuring out that the core idea, answering those questions through those interconnected pieces of flash, creating a larger narrative between this almost is 2 generations of fathers and sons, really. Neil is a chapbook that has some of those stories, and I'm working on a much larger novella in flash. There's a really fantastic book about creating interconnected flash pieces to create a larger narrative. It's called My Very End of the Universe. 5 novellas in flash and a study of form, and it contains flash novellas by Tiff Holland, Aaron Teal, Meg Pokris, Chris Bauer, and Margaret Patton Chapman. And the idea here is that these are flash pieces that function by themselves, but when you combine them together, they're contributing to an overall larger narrative where there's callbacks to earlier pieces or callbacks to different characters or references. In here, Aaron Teal's Shampoo Horns, the focus is a tornado that's hit their trailer park and destroyed basically destroy the trailer park. So it's things that happened beforehand before this disaster occurred. So for me, it goes back to the whole core idea, using Flash to explore that core idea and let it branch out organically and creating pieces that function by themselves, but also those pieces, when you combine them, tell a much larger story.
Thanks. I'm also going to go in and plug one of my favorite books that does something similar. This is Einstein's Dreams by Alan Lightman. And every chapter is a piece of Flash that plays with this idea of what happens if time were to pass differently than what we expect. And the same characters are always present, but they're put in different situations. And it's mostly a thought experiment, and it's a really neat book. You can do this with your own work, or you can do this kind of interconnected narrative across multiple authors, and it can be a really fun and innovative project. So like if you look at any of the 15 Views books that Burrow Press has put out, it's basically the same thing. It's 15 different Flash pieces written by 15 different authors, and they're all piggybacking off of one another to tell this larger interconnected story. So that can be a really cool study of the genre to see how different pieces can fit together, maybe in unexpected ways, and you can play with it in your own work, especially if you are having trouble with keeping your attention on a project, or you have this idea but you can't, like, for whatever reason, are having trouble writing long stuff. It may be really refreshing to just write little snippets and then put those snippets together, and then suddenly you've got a book, and that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, Amelia Gray's AMPM also does the same thing. And also Matthew, oh God, what's his last name?
Oh no.
Matthew, I'm going to think about it. Matthew Salaces, who read here a few months back, or actually a month ago. He has a Flash novella called I'm Not Just Saying, I'm Just Saying. And it's all interconnected Flash pieces about a man who discovers that he had a 5-year-old son from a hookup that he had like 5 years ago.
You don't have to. Okay. So since we've been kind of pitching books, the last question that I have before I want to open the floor to the audience is, if you want to learn more about Flash, what or who should people be reading besides what we've already pitched thus far?
So Jay already brought this up, but I think that poetry is extremely important for fiction writers. I'm gonna just this is controversial, I feel like, but I think that in order to get better at writing fiction, in order to be able to say things in fewer words, it's incredibly important to study poetry, and it's incredibly important to study how poetry sounds, the rhythmic nature of writing those lines and turning them into sentences of your own. There's nothing like that. It's gonna I tell my students this and they don't listen to me, but it'll definitely make you a better fiction writer. I know that the conventions of the genre are significantly different, but again, especially if you're writing Flash, learning to tell that story in a brief way, when you're limited to a page, for example, it really forces you to dig into what that inciting moment is and focus in on whatever that magical, just that thing is that you're trying to write about in that short amount of space.
And I would even go a little bit further. I would say slam poetry more than anything, because slam poetry is already very narrative driven. And the stuff that really transcends the slam poetry format is the stuff that's very image heavy, but also you're getting some kind of narrative arc out of those 3 minutes, because it's a slam poem. A 3-minute slam poem is about, I would estimate, about 300 words. That's a piece of Flash right there. Is one of those, like a slam poem. So Button, from that perspective, you can go to Button Poetry's YouTube channel. They have tons and tons of slam poems. They're based out of Minneapolis. And they do really good work in terms of promoting the genre, or not. It's not really a genre technically; it's more like a movement. From a pure Flash fiction, my favorites are Amelia Gray. She's a fantastic weird writer. She has her first book was AMPM, which is all interconnected Flash pieces, and she's a fantastic short story writer as well. John Giudizo. He is a writer that's based out of Minneapolis. He's one of my all-time favorite Flash fiction writers. His stuff is funny. He primarily deals with humor, and he's actually his Flash fiction chapbook is in this collection of Flash fiction chapbooks called "They Could No Longer Contain Themselves." So I strongly recommend him to check him out. XTX, so it's exactly as it sounds. It's spelled X-Ray Tango X-Ray. She's a fantastic flash fiction writer who writes under a pseudonym. She has a couple of flash fiction collections out, I want to say, and a novella called Billy the Bull, which was really tight and really condensed. Roxane Gay has some of her earlier work has flash components in it as well. Strongly recommend checking her out. Period. If you don't, if you aren't familiar with any of her work, go and check her out. Brian Oliu, he does lyric essays, and he does lyric essays on pop. So he has a whole collection of lyric essays where they were originally posted on Tuscaloosa, Alabama's Craigslist misconnection site. And they're beautiful. They're gorgeous. They're gorgeous lyric essays. And he also has one on it's called Levels End, and it's in a larger book called Leave Luck to Heaven, where it's lyric essays about boss battles in Nintendo games. He has lyric essays about wrestlers, and he's currently working on lyric essays about running. So Brian Oliu, that's Oliu, he's another one that, and again, this is where Flash is a lot of fun because you can take these weird things and use Flash to tell just these amazing stories. I could go on and on about like all the people that I like. I know we need to have you guys ask questions. So, but those are the writers I can think of off the top of my head that are like, go read these people. They're really interesting. From a lit mag perspective, nanofiction, Nano fiction. They publish twice a year. They have online archives. They focus on fiction that's 300 words or less.
I want to add to one of my favorite literary journals, and if you're not taking advantage of free online literary journals, please start doing that immediately. One of my favorite is Diagram. They publish just the weirdest, most wonderful little treats. So, just short and good and brief and amazing. So that's another one that I like too.
If you're not reading Brevity, read Brevity. Brevity's nonfiction. If you want fiction, Smoke Long Quarterly is also another really good one. And frankly, you can just Google flash fiction literary journals and so many will pop up. Most journals, even if they don't specialize in flash, will still accept flash and will still publish it. So you might find it, anywhere. And then if you want some anthologies that talk about really short stuff, I can recommend Flash Fiction Forward, which was edited by James Thomas and Robert Shepard. There's so many weird different styles of Flash in here that it's really good. This is a great collection. And then there's edited by Mark Mills, Crafting the Very Short Story. This was published before I think the term Flash fiction happened, but pretty much everything in here is Flash, and it's really good. And it's a great collection, and it's like stuff that's older, so you can see that this form has actually been around for a while. We've just only recently put a name to it. So with that being said, I think we have like 20 minutes, right?
20 minutes.
No. Yeah, could you?
Oh.
We have a microphone. We're so fancy. Thank you, Shawn.
Let's not make this Springer-esque.
Check. Okay.
All right, does anyone have any questions you'd like? I promise we don't bite. I'm not shy. Yes, Elena.
For the teachers on the panel, I'm not standing up. Could be scared. Have you ever had a class write an interconnected flash fiction as like a project for class where they're all writing on the same thing and it's all interconnected and they workshop it?
I have not personally done this, but I have heard of a lot of people who have tried this, and it works really well if they are working in a really specific setting. Mm-hmm. So what I've heard of some classes do is they create a town that maybe only has like four corners, like it's an intersection basically. And they do some world building together, they create characters, and they create like kind of a setting, and then they all get to write within this realm. And it grows and evolves, and it can be really interesting, especially if the class takes turns or if they're writing concurrently. I've also heard of classes where they use tabletop role-playing games, like they will play a campaign in class of like D&D. So they'll have a Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that, they will play a campaign together, and then their homework is to go home and write a piece of Flash about something that happened in the campaign. So they're using their imagination, they're all pulling from the same experience, but then the results are awesome. They come up with so many different things. I would kill to try something like this. And it's super cool, but I've heard it works extremely well. The students are very engaged. It's short, so you can tell them, go do this, and then come back later that week, and they've got it there, and you can all read it and kind of talk about it and workshop it. It's awesome.
Yeah, one of the things that I've tried that unfortunately died, but I will try again when I find the right class that's willing to do it. I had them write on the same topic, so they actually worked on and then revised and edited their own mini anthology set in, as you were saying, the same setting. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. I've tried it a couple of times. If you get the right group of people that are willing to work together, that is really successful. But sometimes people, they like to do their own thing, and so it's yeah. So like I said, when you get that right mix of writers that are willing to emulate what it's like in an actual writing room when you have to write collaboratively, regardless of whether or not you like the person next to you, it works out really well.
Any other questions, concerns? Oh, yeah, Susan.
Easy enough.
Grievances.
No grievances.
I have a question for Nicole.
I'm ready.
As an editor who receives Flash nonfiction in your reading cues, can you tell me what characteristics make a Flash piece fail, make you not choose it? What is not happening? Because I get a lot of vignettes, little descriptive pieces, but there's no reflection, there's no connection, there's nothing at stake. It was pretty, but... So I'm wondering what criteria you use.
That's an easy one. I'm ready. One of the books that I mentioned very briefly but forgot to actually tell you who the author was, so it's called The Situation and the Story by Vivian Gornick. So this is one of the most important books that I ever read, and spoiler alert, I actually really dislike this book because she says some things about experimental work that I really disagree with, as a hybrid writer. So she's really, really into more traditional stuff than I am. But the first half of the book, that's actually about the situation and the story, really important. So it's worth checking out. So I guess I could explain it this way. So if you ask me, how was your day? And, what did you do today? And I said, well, I brushed my teeth. I put on my socks. I put on my pants. I put on my shirt. I walked out this is going to get really boring really quickly, right? Because I'm just going over all of this random stuff that you guys don't want to hear about. So that's my situation. That's the day that I had. The difference between a situation and a story is, well, let me tell you what happened, and then I actually go into something that has a narrative arc with a coherent beginning, middle, and end, where, I'm actually telling you something. And one of the big things that I have noticed is, and I guess there's a lot to be said about writers distancing themselves from the emotional content of the work enough to be able to actually see the work for what it is. And when I was a young writer, I was very bad at this, and I did not realize for many, many, many years that I was writing situations and not stories. And I was kind of successful at publishing situations, so nobody was telling me I was doing the wrong thing. This is not something that anybody called me on or anything like that. So I went on doing this for a really long time, way longer than I should have. But I was also the kind of person that was wearing sunglasses inside, and I was a bad person. So I'm better now. But that kind of self-awareness is extremely important, and writers don't get born with self-awareness. This is a thing that I think develops over time. Reading other people's writing, I think, is something that if you're not already doing, definitely get involved in some kind of writers group where you're able to give critical feedback to somebody else, because being able to catch these kind of issues in somebody else's writing will sort of help you figure out, okay, wait, I'm actually writing about nothing. I need to stop doing that. And it's really hard. I've poured my entire writerly poet's soul, onto a page and realized, 1,000 words in, 2,000 words in, holy crap, this isn't about anything. And so this is why I have to plan, because if I don't, I end up writing these things that don't matter. And, again, the reason I got away with doing this for so many years is because I'm really good at writing sentences with really pretty words in them, so nobody noticed that I was writing about nothing. And you might be one of these people too that is really successful at using beautiful words, and so nobody has called you on it yet that these sentences are actually revealing nothing.
I think it's a similar problem to what you
Yeah.
see in the longer pieces. It's
Yeah.
just a tinier version. Really good
Exactly.
sentences, really pretty pictures, but there's either no arc, narrative. The story doesn't even have an arc, and there's no connection or larger reflection on what it means. There's no change. There's no
Absolutely.
change. Yeah.
That's why structure is so important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's it. Where they think that the small space is the structure, and there's no structure within
Yeah.
the small space.
Yeah, and since it's small, it is up to so much more scrutiny. So if you are writing a piece of Flash, like you might have gotten away with some lazy sentences in a bigger piece, but if you're writing Flash, like, oh man, if something is not right, it is going to stick out right away, and you are going to get crucified for it. So like, you've got to be on your game every single line, every single sentence, every single page break, like everything that you do has got to be as perfect as you can get it, because it's just so under a microscope.
Yeah.
Can I add to Nicole's answer, because I used to edit too for a while. I actually read cover letters because a cover letter would tell me so much about a person. So like I've had cover letters that told me what the story was about, and that's immediately a no. I'm not going to read your story. Or telling me that they have all of these wonderful accolades. I'm like, then you've increased my expectations of your work. So when your work sucks, then no. So I think it's really all of the things Nicole said in terms of what fails as a flash piece, that lack of narrative arc, that lack of structure. If your work doesn't have anything that's really there that we don't really come away with, then absolutely. But I would say also on top of that, even before, like I look for reasons to disqualify somebody even before I read their piece, because I have like over 300 pieces in the queue by myself to work.
Well, and I think it invites more people to send out a lot more because they're short.
Right.
They're not finished.
Right.
I think that's just part of
Yeah.
what comes with it.
Right.
Oh, it's short. It's done. I'll send it out.
Absolutely. Do we have any other? Thank you so much. Any other questions? Sir? Yeah.
Yes,
Come on down.
I want to come to the front though. I'm wondering about the mental transitions that a writer has to make if you're drafting a piece of flash fiction and then also a novel, since the value systems seem to be so different. Like if you're working on both and you move back and forth between both, how do you make that transition and let go of some of what you have to let go of or adapt, if that makes sense?
Okay, so you're asking about the mental transitions that you have to make when you're working between two very different projects, such as a long-form fiction project like a novel versus a flash fiction piece, given that there may be different style considerations.
So that's something that I've done, and I've done quite a bit. So I'm always working on like 5 different projects simultaneously. So whereas I work on one and then I leave the other one go, and then okay, let me go ahead and switch. Then work on that project. Then when I get bored or I get tired, then switch. So for me, I've developed kind of a mental firewall between all of those projects. So I'm working on the interconnected stories about intergenerational kidnappings. I have a project where I'm working on linked flash fiction involving a love story between one person and the Kool-Aid Man. I have another piece where I'm creating job aids for things that don't really exist. So how to do abstract things. And I think it's just a matter of knowing what each of your projects are, and then creating those firewalls between those projects so there's no bleed over between, like if you're writing flash fiction and then you're like, okay, I'm tired, I'm bored, or I want to do something else, and I have this novel that I'm working on, kind of developing and making that mental gear shift to where you go from working on that flash piece to working on that novel, and back and forth. And I think that just comes with time, really, is being able to juggle like that. Because you will if you're working on a novel, I'm sure that people, and myself included, I get bored working on the same thing over and over. And some people can do that. Some people can work on the same thing for eons. I can't do that. I need to be able to switch and do something else at a given point. So it's a matter of just developing your firewalls between projects and developing that ability to gear shift between the two, so that way you're not like not bleeding over your novel stuff with your fiction Flash, and not bleeding over, unless you're doing that, unless you're creating a novel out of interconnected Flash pieces, then that's even better. So that's from my own personal experience working on the several projects that we're currently juggling.
Yeah, I think we all juggle multiple projects at once, and I know at least for me, I make sure all of my projects are really, really, really different from one another. So like I have a book of poetry I'm working on that is mostly nonfiction and it's very specific, whereas the series of connected Flash that I'm working on are really like it's totally weird science fiction-y, like they're really different, completely different worlds. So that way, like, it's whatever I'm in the mood for, whatever I'm feeling like some days you just wake up and you're like, I need to do short attention span stuff, or I really need to work on my sentences. But in terms of the overall craft considerations for something that's really short or something that's really long, I would say that the value overall would be almost the same. Like, I'm going to spend the same amount of time on my sentences for a novel as I would spend in Flash. But that's just me.
Yeah, we are all really similar in this respect. Like I'm working on a nonfiction collection right now about capital punishment and the American prison system and how horrible it is. And then when I get tired of writing myself into tears about how depressing that project is, I'm doing a book of Latin translations where I'm taking Lucretius and I'm turning it into rap songs. So you have to be able to put on different hats. For me, what works, I make myself a soundtrack for each project. So I'll do a playlist. I'll do my Lucretius playlist where I get myself into the ancient mood, right? Let's talk some Latin, right? Because come on, that's the best. So I'll do just music or just something that reminds me of that. When I'm working on the prison book, I will listen to some other things that are maybe kind of sad to make me sad. So then I'm writing sad stuff. So that helps me a lot because it helps get me in the right mental space. So I'll do my playlist, I'll go for a walk, and then I'll come back and I'm actually ready to work on something different. And that helps me out a lot too, because I think that the transition between writing different projects is just as important as the transition between, your day job and then your night job, which is writing, because for most of us, writing is not our day job. And being able to make that mental transition is extremely important. There are a lot of students in the room. Most of us have, like I said, a day job where we have some sort of responsibility that is not writing. So transitioning from project to project, transitioning from persona to persona, whatever it is really important to find something that will sort of help trigger that motion between one and the next thing, so you can try something else.
Thank you.
Oh, it's actually, sorry, it's funny that you mentioned the whole music thing, because there's been pieces or projects where, not necessarily a playlist, but a particular album. Like all the Neil stuff, most of it was written while Suhan Stevens' Carrie and Lowell, which if you haven't listened to that album, go and do that. And if you have,
it's really good.
It's really emotionally devastating.
Yeah.
I saw him live down the street last year, and I was like half the time trying not to cry during his set because it was absolutely heartbreaking. And it wore Carrie and Lowell. So it's Carrie and Lowell by Suhan Stevens. That's Sufjan Stevens. It's not pronounced Sufjan Stevens. It's Suhan. I don't know why, but that it is. So it's a kind of a linked album dealing with the death of his estranged mother, and it talks about a lot of kind of like the childhood, when that brief period where they had a relationship. And it's a really gorgeous, it's a really heartbreaking piece of and it really is. It's a really linked album, because it really tells a complete story about dealing with the death of this person who was the birth mother, but he never really had a relationship because of all of her drug and alcohol and mental illness issues.
So we've got time for just one more question.
All right. Do you have any advice for editing your own flash fiction processes you use? And I know you said you cut down, and I kind of do that too. Is there any point that you would say you need to look at yourself and say stop?
That's a really good question. I found, at least for me, I do editing and revision in stages, where instead of trying to edit everything at once and then getting really overwhelmed, I will look for one thing while I'm editing. So I might be editing for imagery. I might be editing for setting. I might be editing for characterization. I may be editing for specifically images that are going to convey that my protagonist is depressed without her coming out and saying, I'm depressed. So like, what can I add in those? And I'll just go layer by layer, and then I'll look at structure. I'll look at my global concerns, your big structure issues, your tone, your organization, your transition issues. And then at that, like once all of that is there in place, I'll move to those more local level issues where you're looking at sentence structure, grammar, word choice, and getting as specific and condensed as I possibly can be. So a single piece may go through 5, 10 revisions, but each revision I'm only looking at one specific thing.
Yeah, one of the things that's really important, I think, is that, and we haven't really talked about this at all, but when I say cut and cut and cut and cut, it doesn't mean that all of that stuff just disappears and gets deleted and goes away. One of the things that has happened to me very recently is that, I ended up taking stuff out, but then used that and started a completely new project. So it's not like you're erasing, and you're never going to see this writing again. In a lot of cases, I keep a text file where I sort of save the stuff that I have cut out because I'm really lazy, and the idea of seeing my writing disappear makes me cry. So, because I don't know. I mean, some people write every day. I don't. And so when I do it, I'm like, oh man, I have diamonds. I can't just get rid of these diamonds. They're so important. That's something that I do too. I sort of migrate into a different text file, and then I'll come back to it later. And I'm like, oh wow, it's a chapbook about Kylo Ren. How cool. That does help a lot.
For me, it all depends. Does it feel finished? Sometimes it may require like a little snip here and there. Sometimes it might require adding more content. It really all depends on the piece. I don't really have a particular. Again, I'm the guy that doesn't plan. So it just, I go up based on gut and feeling and figuring out based on what I'm looking at, how much editing does it really need and where does it get edited. And sometimes after, if it gets rejected a few times, I go, okay, so maybe I need to reconsider certain things. But for me, it's all based on feeling and feeling whether or not the work feels finished and feels complete and feel that I feel good about writing it after I'm done.
Thank you. I do believe we are out of time, so thank you all so much for coming. We appreciate it. Oh, wait.
Really quick.
My bad.
One thing. So I am paneling, I'm running the Performing Your Work panel at 3, I think it's at 3:20 or 3:30. The schedule's on there. 2:30. Okay. Thank you. So basically that particular panel is where you actually get to read 2 minutes of your own work, and then you actually get constructive feedback by our panelists. So if you are interested, because there's not really enough workshops out there that deal with actually reading your work in public, if you are interested in doing that, in being part of that, please see me. I will put you on the list. I will guarantee you that our panelists will be like Randy and Paula, not like Simon. If you are familiar with American Idol, the idea is a safe space to give you all constructive feedback on performing your work in public for the first time. So I just wanted to plug that out. And Weird Fiction is next here.
Yep. So again, thank you guys so much. Have an awesome day. Enjoy the rest of Litlando. We really appreciated seeing you here.